When it comes to ethnicity in the scriptures, everyone longs to see a representation of themselves through the mentioned characters. In fact, many scholars have maintained the idea that the main characters of the scripture were European. As of late, meaning the last few decades, there's been a push in the black scholastic world to envision the overwhelming majority of the Bible characters as black under the guise that the whole world was black at some point. And then the Europeans came along and diluted populations, specifically in the Eurasian world. They give this diatribe as if at any point in our existence, as a race of mankind, there was a time at which the majority of black women in these areas were being sexually violated by the white men, and the black men were simultaneously being chosen by the white women, and they created this mixed race of people who maintain very little African phenotypes. Inevitably, both factions do agree that when you read the term Cush or Ethiopia in the scriptures, that there in those terms lie the most blatantly, undeniably Negro representation that the Most High himself has stamped in the sight of all who dare to read the scriptures. Do you believe that the terms Ethiopia and subsequently Cush are referring to those of African ancestry? What's the etymology of the word Ethiopia when it's used in scripture? What do we do if it turns out that the Ethiopian concepts of scripture are actually pseudo scholarship? Well, get your pen and pad ready because this episode might be one that you want to take some notes from. You know I want to talk about it. Let's go. Here I'm far from home. Welcome to the Ready Brew. My name's T Edge. And before we get going, I'd like to thank my most recent subscribers for subscribing to the channel. Hopefully this episode will be one that you can't wait to share with your people. Now, if you're new to the content, feel free to peruse and drop comments on any of the older videos. And if you feel compelled by the end, you can just turn your phone to the side and click my watermark down here in the corner and just become a subscriber. But without further ado, today we're talking about the Ethiopians and the Cushite people. When it comes to blacks in the Bible, the impression is given that the representation of Africans is a position of a lower degree or status. It's so much so that in places that it's perceived that the scripture is mentioning blacks, there's almost this air of confidence in being portrayed as second-rate citizens who are proxied into notoriety through either nuptials, meaning marriage, or proselytism. There have been entire curriculums built around this premise, and here in the 21st century, there's hardly been any pushback. But what if I could potentially show proof that these representations are false and contrived by our most recent religious predecessors and are being fomented by our religious contemporaries? Now, don't get me wrong. I don't believe that most are being deceptive. Most people were just reared in the misunderstanding as implied and never saw a need to think contrary to the ideology. Very few, especially of late, will have ever considered anything otherwise. So let's look into a couple scripture references that are most used. First, we have the book of Numbers, chapter 12, beginning at verse number 1. And Miriam and Aaron spake against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married, for he had married an Ethiopian woman. And they said, hath the Lord indeed spoken only to Moses? Hath he not spoken also by us? And the Lord heard it. Now let's go to Acts 8, beginning at verse number 26. And the angel of the Lord spake unto Philip, saying, Arise, and go toward the south, unto the way that goeth down from Jerusalem unto Gaza, which is desert. And he arose and went. And behold, a man of Ethiopia, a eunuch of great authority under Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, have had the charge of all her treasure and had come to Jerusalem for to worship, was returning and sitting in his chariot, read Esaias the prophet. We are commonly told that these two scriptures are referring to the African presence blatantly stated. Ethiopian must mean African, right? After all, scholars come along referencing Ptolemy, who called the Egyptians Ethiopians. Some made another inference that then tied Nimrod to Africa, and it ultimately came full circle with the Queen Candace or Candake reference in the story about Philip and the eunuch. This tied all of it back to black people. Not only was Ethiopia referring to blacks, but it now was used by many scholarly folk, both black and white, to promote the idea that the Middle East was once a black land that began lightening with the invasion of Caucasian people. Now I know my next statement is going to be super controversial, especially where African Americans are concerned. And admittedly, it's hard for me to say this, but our beloved Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop, one of the most respected black scholars on Egypt, he was mistaken about a few things. The main thing, for the sake of this presentation, is the belief that the Egyptians were a Negro population. I believe he was correct on the idea or the belief that there was an influence of the Negro populations on the Egyptian culture because the Negroes were present in Egypt, those Negroes being the Shemites. They had communities in Egypt. This is why Mary and Joseph could take their young child to Egypt and hide in plain sight. They obviously settled in one of the Shemite territories in Egypt. In fact, when we read the story of Joseph, Potiphar's wife called Joseph a Hebrew as if it was derogatory. Then you have an instance where God told Israel not to return to Egypt, but they were defiant and returned to Egypt anyway. The Hebrews and the Egyptians were not the same, but there was indeed some mixing going on. Now I know someone's going to say that Moses was mistaken for an Egyptian. And I'll say that yes, and even Joseph's brothers didn't recognize him as anything other than an Egyptian. Do you think it was because he didn't look like his brothers? Or do you think Egypt had a style or fashion like America has its own style or fashion? Moses could clearly tell the difference between his people, the Hebrews, and the Egyptian he killed. Likewise, his people knew the difference between he and the Egyptians whose house he was raised up in. Also, when we go back to Joseph's case, he was sold as a child, and at the point where his brothers encountered him, he could have been 1.5 feet taller, 100 pounds heavier, with a much deeper voice and facial hair. Simply stated, there are too many inferences made from the story and a contrived history that could be wrong. Then what about Paul? He was mistaken for an Egyptian too, right? How do we know that the scripture meant that he looked like an Egyptian? Were there TVs back then? Did they have cameras to take pictures? No, they didn't. The only thing they had was word of mouth and maybe a few sketches. Now, I surmise that it was because as Paul was being jailed, that the chief captain heard as the people yelled one thing or another that he was the Egyptian who had caused the sedition that he was asked about. When we go to Acts 21, beginning at verse 30 through 39. And all the city was moved, and the people ran together, and they took Paul and drew him out of the temple, and forthwith the doors were shut. And as they went about to kill him, tidings came unto the chief captain of the band that all Jerusalem was in an uproar, who immediately took soldiers and centurions and ran down unto them. And when they saw the chief captain and the soldiers, they left beating Paul. Then the chief captain came near and took him and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains, and demanded who he was and what he had done. And demanded who he was and what he had done. And some cried one thing, some another, among the multitude. And when he could not know the certainty for the tumult, he commanded him to be carried into the castle. And when he came upon the stairs, so it was that he was borne of the soldiers for the violence of the people. For the multitude of the people followed after, crying, "Away with him!" And as Paul was to be led into the castle, he said unto the chief captain, "May I speak unto thee?" Who said, "Canst thou speak Greek? Art not thou that Egyptian, which before these days made us an uproar, and led us out into the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers?" But Paul said, "I am a man which am a Jew of Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I beseech thee, suffer me to speak unto the people." The scripture says that he couldn't know for sure. So it wasn't that Paul looked Egyptian, it was that he was accused of being the particular Egyptian, and the people who looked like him were the ones accusing him. So it couldn't be that he looked Egyptian. Furthermore, the Egyptians were Hamites, just like the inhabitants of Iraq, aka Cush, just like the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah, just like the inhabitants of Canaan land, and all the other countries from Egypt to modern day India. Okay, so on to the meat of the subject. If the inhabitants of the area of Cush were Hamites, and Cush was territorially located in modern day Iraq, why is it that the translation of Cush to the word Ethiopia immediately holds the connotation and designation of Africa? Is it that the word Cush means black? I mean, if we look at the Hebrew word Cush pictographically, it has nothing to do with color, unless, you reference the color of the open palm, which certainly isn't black. But I know that went over some heads, so I digress. But is it possible that the derivation was formulated from a racial perspective? James Strong, the creator of the Strong's Concordance, was a Methodist theologian and Bible scholar who was born in 1822 at the height of chattel slavery in the United States. Slavery was a pervasive practice that he was witness to in his lifetime, for the most of his lifetime at that, because he died in 1894. The Strong's Concordance itself was published in 1890. So do you think maybe there was a racial bias during the time of the conception? The successor of the Strong's was the Brown Driver Briggs, or BDB. It was first published in 1906, being translated from the Hebrew German lexicon. And I think it's very coincidental that the same people who had dispelled the Jews just a little more than 400 years prior would use the same meaning as the Strong's to understand the meaning of Cush. Think about it. Every lexicographer since has used the same reasoning and understanding with the same Bible references. Is there a way to refute the understanding and translation that these men derived using their bias? Can we use the Bible and the references that it gives using the exact geographical demarcations? Or were these men smarter than the Bible authors? Can we use the archaeology found, or did the Hamites just migrate through the land of the Middle East from Africa, leaving artifacts behind? What can we use outside of saying that these men were likely racists who had been influenced by the times and the understanding of the curse of Ham?